Okay, we are on volume 9, Orach Chaim. We finished Talis and Tefillin, and now we're going to learn about the Zmanei Talis and Tefillin, the laws of the Zmanim for when you can put on Tefillin and Talis, and the other dinim about Zmanim of time, right? In the previous, on page 97, in the previous volume, and the first two shiurim, we have studied some of the laws of the mitzvahs of tzitzis and tefillin. In this year, we will discuss one final element, the proper time for fulfilling them. We learned in shiur 1 that the mitzvah of tefillin is performed during the day. Now, what is defined as day with regard to this mitzvah? When is the earliest time that it may be fulfilled? Does tzitzis have the same status as tefillin with regard to the proper time of fulfillment? Is the definition of day, when it comes to these mitzvot, identical to that of other mitzvot that need to be performed in the day, such as reciting Shema, the Amidah, Mila, blowing the shofar, shaking the lulav, reading the Megillah? Is it the same definition, or is it mitzvah dependent? Some mitzvah's definition of day maybe is different. In order to answer these questions, we're going to study some of the fundamental concepts related to the subject of halachic zmanim, particularly Allos HaShachar, dawn, Netzach Chama, sunrise, and Mishiyakir, recognizing someone. These three halachic zmanim are the most relevant to understanding the earliest time for performing the mitzvos of talis and tefillin, as well as other daytime mitzvos. The zmanim related to other parts of tefillah, such as the latest time to recite Shema and the Amidah, that's going to be discussed in volume 10 of Tzurba M'Rabanan, where there we're going to learn the detailed halachos of Shema and the Amidah. So here we're going to talk about the earliest time you can recite it, but we're not going to talk about the last time, for example, what's the latest that you can read Shema and do Shmona Esrei. So how do we calculate Allos HaShachar? The first stage of the halachic day is Allos HaShachar, dawn. This is the time that the first light begins to be seen in the nighttime sky. Now, Allos HaShachar is mentioned in the very first Mishnah in Masechta Brachos. Me'emasai korin Shema ba'arvin, so right away, we are introduced to Allos HaShachar. We see from the opinion of Rabbi Gamliel that night concludes at Allos HaShachar, because the first Mishnah in Brachos is dealing with Kriya Shema Shel Arvis. So when is the last time, what's the limit of night where you could say Kriya Shema all night, but once day starts, you can't say Kriya Shema of the evening anymore? The Mishnah told us, according to Rabbi Gamliel, it's Allos HaShachar. Therefore, any mitzvah performed at night, such as reciting Kriyat Shema, Mariv, or laning the Megillah, we're talking about laning the Megillah at night, may no longer be done after this time of Allos. The Mishnah states, ideally, that Shema of evening should be recited before Chatzos to ensure that one does not fall asleep beforehand. But the strict halacha is that it may be recited all night if one did not recite it by Chatzos. Now, this Allos is also the time at which the halachic status of the next day begins to take effect. Thus, the prohibition to eat on a minor fast, Shiva Sarbatamuz, Aser B'Teves, takes effect at that time. Allos, that's why when we wake up, those of us who wake up to eat or drink something before a minor fast, you need to do it before Allos HaShachar, because Allos Shachar starts the halachic day.
This reminds me of the Haggadah.
The Haggadah means the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that you can eat the Korban Pesach really all night.
No,
But
no,
they made a gzeira that they stop by Chatzos.
Not that. I'm talking about what the Talmidim came. Higiyazman
Kriyash Mashal Shel Shach. Yeah, that could be. Maybe they learned until 3 to 4 hours of the day already, and maybe they were going to miss Kriyash Shema, right? Or maybe they wanted to. Maybe we'll see. We'll see that the first time you could say Kriyash Shema is Mishiach here, and maybe this Talmidim came then because maybe they wanted to do it bismano, right away, the first time that they could do it.
Right. Well, the classic answer is they were hiding in the cave, and the students had to come and tell them that the sun is rising.
Okay.
Because they were hiding from the Romans at that time.
Right. So this is also the time. This is a very interesting halacha here, that the official rabbinic prohibition to eat before davening in the morning takes effect. Meaning, if you wake up before Allos HaShachar, you can eat. But if you wake up after Allos HaShachar, there's a prohibition to eat before you daven. So that the trigger of that prohibition is Allos HaShachar. Many poskim write that one should not begin a meal even 1/2 hour before this time, to ensure that one does not get carried away with eating and forget to daven on time. So one who performs daytime mitzvahs such as shofar and lulav after this time has fulfilled his obligation, even though ideally they should be done after nates, after sunrise. And the Mishnah in Megillah says that cleanly. In Kornas Megillah, right? You don't read the Megillah. Below Malin, you don't do Mila. Mila has to be done in the day by Yom Hashmini, Yimol Basar or Lasso. Below Tovlin, those that require Tefillah in the daytime, you don't do Tefillah until day. Below Mazin, you don't sprinkle Paraduma. So in women have 7 days of Nidus followed by 11 days of Zivus. In the times of the Gemara, so if a woman was bleeding during her days of Nidus, and let's say on the 6th day of Nidus, she stopped bleeding. And then on the night of the 7th, she could already go to the mikvah and have relations with her husband. Because the law that we follow now, that Jewish women count 7 nikiyim after even 1 tipa of blood, is because we don't know whether the blood is zivus blood or nidus blood. And she might be a zava gedola, which requires zayin nikiyim, so we treat any blood as zayin nikiyim. Now, in the times of Chazal, during the 11 days of zivus, if they bled for 1 day, and then let's say they were clean the next day, she's called a shemeres yom keneged yom. So the next day, if she remained clean, she goes to the mikvah, and she can already have relations with her husband, even though she bled the day before. But they went to the mikvah in the daytime. So that mikvah has to be in the day. And this Mishnah says, lo tidbol, or doing all these things, Megillah, Mila, right? Ad shetinei tzacham, until sunrise. However, says the Mishnah, kulon sha'asu misha'olam od hashachar b'di'evet kosher. Means lechatchila, you should wait till nates to blow the shofar or to do Mila. But if you did it after Allos, you'd be Makayim the mitzvah. Now, there are 2 opinions among the Achronim as to the precise stage of light referred to as Allos HaShachar, that is halachically considered the beginning of the day. So the Mogen Avraham says, when the very first ray of light is visible on the eastern horizon. And the Bir Alocha, and the Eliyah Rabbah says, it's shortly afterwards, when the light illuminates the eastern horizon a bit more. Since the stage of light referred to by the second approach is unclear exactly when it takes place, most of the discussion among the sources revolves around the first approach, which we're going to follow in the rest of the shir. Look at footnote number 4. See the Prima Godim. who mentions the second approach and acknowledges that it's not clear exactly when this point takes place. It seems that the Gemara in Psachim, which we're going to refer to below, is referring to that first stage according to all opinions, which is the first ray of light. Thus, all Achronim would agree that the calculations discussed below refer to the first stage of light, and those Achronim who follow the second stage as Alot HaShachar would hold that the new halachic day occurs shortly after the various times presented for the first stage. It's a few minutes after. For more on the subject of the different opinions concerning the amount of light present at Allos HaShachar, you can see the Piskei Tshuvas. It should be noted that according to the Pnei Halacha, right, Rabbi Yezer Melamed, the accepted time of 72 minutes prior to Nates refers to the second approach, not to the first approach. It's his opinion that the first approach would calculate a lot even at an earlier time. We're going to see where we get the 72-minute business in a minute. The Rambam explain in the Perush HaMishnayos. The Rambam wrote, of course, many. He has three major sform that we see halacha in. The main one is the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, which is his compilation of all the halachas. Then he had a Perush HaMishnayos. In the Perush HaMishnayos, there's a lot of halachic material. Then, of course, in the Mor Nevuchim, particularly in the section which deals with Tamei HaMitzvahs, he also has a lot of discussion on halacha. So here, in the Perush HaMishnayos in Brachas, he says, Omar HaShachar, which is another way of saying Allos, Hu ha'omar ha'noitzetz b'fat mizrach, koidem Allos HaShamash. It's like the first twinkling of light before sunrise. And then he says like this, Kisha'a v'choimesh min ha'shos ha'shavos. Shos ha'shavos, he's referring to a 60-minute hour, where every hour is equal. That is juxtaposed to the concept of shos zmanios. So, for example, in halacha, on March 22nd and September 22nd, which is the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. What does that mean? It means the day and night are exactly the same. 12-hour day, 12-hour night. As the autumn from September 22nd to December 22nd, the night gets less, the day gets less and less, and the night gets longer and longer. And then, of course, it from December 22nd to the vernal equinox, the night gets shorter again. And then, so only on the September 22nd, March 22nd, will shows zmanios be the same as shows shavos, where you have a 60-minute halachic hour. But for example, in the wintertime, where the daytime may only have 10 hours of daylight and 14 hours of nighttime, so the 10-hour period has to be divided by 12. So the halachic hour might be only 50 minutes, not 60 minutes. But the Rambam here is giving us a calculation of Allos based on 1 hour and a fifth. Now, a fifth of an hour is 12 minutes, right? 60 divided by 5 is 12. Excuse me. 60 divided by 5 is 12. So you have 12 plus 60, 72 minutes. So this 72 minutes is based on this Rambam, who says that the period of time prior to Nates, which defines Allos, is 72 minutes. It's an important source. According to the Rambam, which the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha quotes, Allos HaShachar refers to the time that the first ray of light can be seen over the eastern horizon, which in his opinion takes place at a fixed interval of about 72 minutes before sunrise. Now, most commentators focus on the Gemara in Psachim as the primary Talmudic source used to determine the precise time of Allos HaShachar, not this Rambam. The Gemara explains that Allos HaShachar precedes sunrise, nates, by the amount of time it takes an average person to walk for a meal. A meal is a unit of length that's approximately a kilometer. So in Psachim, Tzadik Dalid, it says, Ume'alos HaShachar ad HaNetzachama arbos milim. The time between Allos and nates is the time that it takes a person to walk 4 kilometers. Similarly, Mishkia Sachama, Liatzesa Kochovim arbos milim. Same thing at nighttime. Sunset and what's called Tseis, that span is also going to be the period of time that it takes to walk for meal. Now, how do you calculate that? There are 3 main opinions how to calculate this measurement. The Truma Sadeshan was a Rishon, says 18 minutes. According to this approach, Allos HaShachar is 72 minutes before sunrise, which comes out like the Rambam. It takes 18 minutes to walk 1 meal, and therefore 4 meal is 72. The Rambam, now there's a steer in the Rambam. Should we know that the Rambam commentary on the Mishnah Psachim appears to contradict the Rambam in the source that we quoted in Brachas, who follows the 72-minute approach, meaning that a meal must be calculated 18 minutes rather than at 24 minutes. Many Achronim, including Mogen Avram, try to resolve this machlokas HaRambam. We're not going to do that here. But according to the Rambam, the Bar Tanura, the Sefer Mitzvos Gedolos, the Smag, hold that the period of time to walk a meal is 24 minutes. Therefore, Allos would be 96 minutes before nates, before sunrise. However, many
we know as a matter of practical reality that it's not 120 minutes from sunset to the stars come out, and the same with Allos first rays. So I mean, that's just a matter of reality at this latitude.
Right. So the shaila is, how could they hold like this?
Right.
Right. So let's see. However, many proponents of this approach hold that Allos is 5 mil before sunrise. Consequently, Allos would be 120 minutes, two hours before sunrise. So, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav brings that. And Yaakov brings up a very good point. There's another sheet of 22 and a half minutes, according to Mariel Nechok Yaakov, which would be 90 minutes. Now, how does the Shulchan Aruch paskin? Shir Melavi Revius Shah, the Chelek Me'esri Min HaShah, right? 1/20th of an hour is 3 minutes. So quarter of an hour, which is 15 minutes plus 3 minutes, is 18 minutes. That's how the Shulchan Aruch says. He paskins like the Truma Sadeshan, that it's 18 minutes, and therefore the space between nates and Allos is 72 minutes. The Mishnah Berurah brings the same thing. Heavy Revius Shah, who Yudches Minutin B'sach HaKol. So the Mishnah Berurah doesn't go through fancy Hebrew language of Chelek and Revius Shah. He just tells us exactly 18 minutes. Now, the Ramah rules this way as well. Thus, as mentioned, Allos HaShachar would be 72 minutes prior to sunrise. And many of the halachic calendars in the Golah are based upon this approach. So, the Bir Halacha cites some poskim, such as the Gra, who rule in accordance with the third approach, where they said it was 22 and a half minutes. Says the Bir Halacha, who is the Chafetz Chaim, right? Ayin Bir Agra, well, the figure Satenu B'Gemara, Ayin B'Sefer Seder Zmanim. Shechoshvin Shir Mil Cheshbon Chav Bes Minutin V'Chetzi, 22 and a half minutes. So he brings the sheet of the Gra. According to this third approach, there would be 90 minutes in between Allos and sunrise. Many of the halachic calendars in Israel are based upon this approach. There is an additional complicating issue that must be mentioned. Although according to all of these approaches, it would seem that Allos HaShachar is defined as a fixed number of minutes prior to sunrise. The scientific reality, as we know it today, is that the amount of light in the sky at this time fluctuates based upon latitude, right, location, and time of year. Moreover, the amount of light at this time also changes, depending on one's latitude and distance from the equator. And the Gra pointed that out, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav agreed with that.
Also, altitude has a variable too. It's the third variable.
And we'll discuss altitude soon. You're referring to like if there's a mountain range in
Right.
front of you or a
Correct.
mountain? Yeah.
If you've been to Death Valley and you go up in Zabriskie Point, you could actually see the sun rises like 30 a minute before it's in the valley.
Right. So we're going to deal with Yaakov's point. The Tzurba deals with that soon. So the Gra says, "Aval shir zeh me'alos hashachar netzachama eino shava b'chol ofek." It's not in the same. It's not the same in the same location. V'gam b'chol zman, and it depends on the season. The Bir Alocha explains, "V'cheinu gam das hagra b'biuro the kol shiurei hagemara bein the dalid minim." These calculations of the 4 mil, hakolu bizman nisan v'tishrei, which is what we talked about, the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. Masha enkein bizman acher mishtana lefi hazman, then it'll be shorter or longer depending on the season. Shein kosav hagra od shir gemara lo nema rak be'afek bavel. He also said that the discussion of the Gemara had to do with what was going on in Babylonia. Based upon the fact that the Gra and the Bir Halacha accept this consideration, many of the current halachic calendars calculate the time of Allos HaShachar, as well as other times, not the way we've been learning a fixed amount prior to Nates, right? It seems from the Shulchan Aruch it's 72 minutes prior to Nates, no matter what, no matter where, what, etc. No, these new calendars are based upon the number of degrees of the sun below the horizon. And here's how the concept is reviewed and explained by the organization known as Maizmani. And the footnotes shows you the full article. The Gemara in Pesachim states that the time span between Allos and Chanetz is as long as the amount of time it takes an average person to walk a distance of 4 mil. According to most poskim, it takes 18 minutes for an average person to walk a distance of 1 mil, and therefore 72 minutes to walk 4 mil. As a result, they hold that Allos HaShachar occurs 72 minutes before sunrise. Others say it takes 22.5 minutes to walk a mil, and therefore 90 minutes to walk 4 mil. Accordingly, Allos HaShachar occurs 90 minutes before sunrise. Either way, Allos HaShachar refers to a specific point in the gradual transition from night to day. Likewise, Tzeisa Kol Chavim refers to a point in the transition between day and night. These transitions occur at a rate which varies from place to place and season to season. Taking these facts into account, the Gra and others ruled that Allos HaShachar cannot be defined in terms of a fixed amount of time before sunrise, and Tzeisa Kol Chavim cannot be defined in terms of a fixed amount of time after sunset. All figures of the Gemara involving a fixed time span were stated specifically in reference to the equinox days, right? We talked about March 22nd and September 22nd, in which day and night are equally long. Furthermore, the figures stated by the Gemara were stated only with regard to Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. For other places and other dates, different but corresponding figures apply. So the Gemara, as we said above, states that Allos HaShachar occurs 4,072 minutes before sunrise. The figure 72 minutes applies only to the equinox days in Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Actual times of Allos HaShachar in other settings may be more or less than 72 minutes before sunrise. The figure of 72 minutes was given as a means of identifying a specific point in the process of dawn, which defines Allos HaShachar. This point can be identified astronomically according to the position of the sun. Where is the sun 72 minutes before sunrise on March 22nd or September 22nd in Yerushalayim? The answer is 16.1 degrees below the horizon. As such, Allos can be defined for all settings as the time when the sun reaches 16.1 degrees below the horizon. So according to this, Allos HaShachar has the same appearance during all seasons of the year anywhere in the world. Of course, it's going to be different based on where you are in terms of when the sun reaches 16.1 degrees below the horizon. This approach of calculating Allos HaShachar and some other zmanim based upon the degree of equivalent of the measurements given has become increasingly widespread in recent years. It's accepted by many contemporary poskim, including Rav Tukachinsky, who was the author of Gesher HaChaim, and he passed away like 1950, something like 1960, something like that. He was operating in Eretz Yisrael in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Rav Yisrael Belsky, of course, we know recently passed away, was the posek for the OU, one of the poskim of the OU. And Rav Willig. We should note that although scientific calculation of halachic zmanim based upon degrees is a relatively new development, in reality, this is how Jews identified Allos HaShachar for centuries. Using degrees is merely a different method to arrive at the same conclusion of determining the amount of light present at the halachic time of Allos HaShachar. And this is exactly what people used to do when they determined Allos HaShachar based on visual assessment of the amount of light outside. If we follow degrees, though, we will arrive at some very peculiar results in specific locations during certain portions of the year. In some locales of Northern Europe, the sun never drops below 16.1 degrees below the horizon in the summertime. For example, the following is the Maizmanim times for London on a typical day in the middle of June. So let's look at page 102. So 16.1 degrees the sun never drops 16.1 degrees below the horizon in London during this part of June. Therefore, in order to decide the halachic time for Allos HaShachar, one would either have to follow a fixed 72 minutes prior to Nates, which would be 3:30 a.m., or simply determine as Chatzos halachic midnight, which is listed here as 1 a.m.
Just to point out, notice it says sunrise level region at sea level, which accounts for the altitude issue there. And also at one point, this might be of interest, I actually did a little study of the calendars that used to appear in shuls. They used to keep them on the bima where they'd say all the times. And they were put out by different organizations. And if you looked at different sheets from different organizations, they varied sometimes by 10 or 15 minutes for the same thing. The most reliable, I would say, is if you go to OU.org, they have a calendar. You can put in any city, and it gives you Nates and the whole bit. So on a practical level, anyone can do that and find out sort of the most acceptable way.
Okay, very good. Other poskim, including the Yalkut Yosef, continue to follow a fixed number of minutes with regard to Allos HaShachar. There's an article in Chakira, those of you who get the Chakira journal by William Gerwitz, and it also goes through a lot of this calculation using degrees.
Okay, one more thing, and then I'll shut up.
Please
Bill
don't.
Bill Gwartz, by the way, finished a 4-part series on the calendar tonight on Torah in Motion, but a number of years ago, he did a 4-part series. He's a mathematician. He used to work for IBM, and he's made a study of this. It's incredible. But if you ever want to hear everything you ever wanted to know, Bill Gwartz has a 4-part series. He did it about 10 years ago on Torah in Motion that explains everything. And
Right.
That's my last comment.
And then there's an article in Chakira, which
He wrote an article in Chakira.
which if you want to read it, and he goes through a lot of this there as well. And
Chakira is online, by the way.
Oh, you can see Chakira online?
Yeah, Chakira is online.
Okay. I'd highly recommend Chakira. There's always very nice articles there. Page 103. Okay, I think we got a very good introduction to Allos. Well, you can't calculate Allos without knowing how to calculate Nates, because it's all based on either 72 minutes before Nates or 90 minutes before Nates. So now we understand a bit more about Allos HaShachar. Let's examine Nates, sunrise. As we mentioned above, this time begins the ideal period during which many daytime mitzvahs were performed, including reciting the Amidah, right? People who daven Vasikin, they daven earlier and they want to get to Shmona Esrei right by nates. They want to be say the Amida by nates.
A question.
Yes.
The word hanetz is the ha part of the word, or what's the real word? What's
No,
the root of
nates hachama.
Yeah, what's
There's
hanetz?
this ha is the ha nates hachama, the nates hachama. It's like saying ha sefer.
Okay.
Okay. The Rambam mentions this time in terms of the proper time for reciting Shema. Eze uzmana bayom, mitzvasa shiatkil likros kodem hanetz hachama, kidei shigmor likros ulevarich bracha achronim hanetz hachama. You want to read it and then make the last birchas Baruch Hashem Gal Yisrael with the netz hachama. V'shir zeh kemo oser shah kodem shetala hashemesh. It's about a tenth of an hour, I guess 6 minutes, before the sun is fully ascended. Some versions of the Rambam state that the measurement is 1 hour rather than tenth of an hour. That's difficult to explain how the time for sunrise could be a full hour before the sun is completely risen in the sky. Mr. Burr suggests that the correct version of the text should state a tenth of an hour or a third of a tenth of an hour. That means we're going to see that nates is when you first see the ball of the sun, or is it when the ball of the sun is completely above the horizon? So based on the Rambam, the Ramah writes that the time of Netz HaChama is a few minutes before the entire sun is visible in the sky. Shir HaNetz HaChama, who kamo asur shah achas, like 1/10 of an hour, koidim sheyale kol gufa shemesh al haaretz, before the complete sun ball is above the horizon. The Bir Alocha cites Rishonim such as Rabbeinu Yonah and Tosfos, and rules that Netz HaChama is defined as the moment that a portion of the sun begins to rise into the sky. Right? Kamo shir shah, and this is the Bir Alocha explaining what does it mean. The Netz HaChama nikras me'esh nikr tchilas richasra ala olam. It's when there's a first inkling that the sun is going to be shining. The Netz HaChama hi hanekuda rishona me'achama shematchelet notzitz haolam. It's the first part of the sun that begins to shine on the world. The kazera inu v'shamanu shnoagim kin kayom anogim kavasikin. We see the people daven vasikin. They don't wait until the sun ball is completely above the horizon. They do it once they first see the beginning of the sun. Some poskim disagree with this assertion and argue that sunrise is defined as the time that the entire sun is risen. And that's the opinion of Rav Matzliach Mazuz in his Tshuva Ish Matzliach. And there's a very nice biography of Rav Mazuz. He was apparently assassinated in Tunisia in 1971 while going to the market, living in Tunisia by Tzorna Yisrael. Haklal ha'oila mirtz Hashem le'inyan shelatenu. Dizmana netz hachama hu davka b'tzeis hashemesh le'einenu ala aretz. When you see the sun visibly is risen over the earth. And the Yalkut Yosef, however, agrees with the position of the Bir Alocha that sunrise is determined by the first rays of light from the sun. Zman tefila vasikin. When you first start seeing the sun above the horizon, and not when the whole sun ball is above. Another dimension of determining the time of Netz HaChama involves whether we follow the time that the sun is actually visible rising into the sky, given the natural topography, which may include mountains that obscure the sun for a few minutes, like Yaakov was telling us, or the time that it would be seen if the horizon was entirely flat. Right? There could be means if you're in a flat place at the beach versus if you got a mountain in front of you, there's going to be a few minutes difference between when you first see the sun. You're going to see the sun a lot earlier when you're in a flat horizon than if there's a mountain in front of you. From the language of the Bir Alocha, it would seem that the determining factor is when the sun is actually seen as it rises above the ground. And that's the conclusion reached by the Maral Diskin, Rav Yisroel Zalman Meltzer, the Chazon Ish, and the Stipler, all poskim in the last century, Many others at the time of the Netzachama is when the sun is first actually seen in the highest point of that city. It seems from some of the sources that take this approach that this time only considers natural topography, such as mountains, for example, as opposed to buildings, and only those that are farther away, but not those that are in immediate proximity to one's location. Thus, mountains in the distance may delay the time of sunrise by a few minutes, according to this approach. But if one lives in a valley, the mountains adjacent to the city would not be considered in terms of calculating the nates. So, for example, if you remember, those of you who were at Griffith Park when we did the Birchas Achama, and a whole bunch of us gathered there, and we were doing it by nates. So there was a far mountain. The San Gabriel Mountains was very far away, and we waited until you could see the sun rise above those mountain ranges. It wasn't a mountain right in front of us. Okay. And this is the practice of many of the Minyan in Eretz Yisrael that recite chakras as Vatikin every morning. And that'll be addressed more in volume 10 when we deal with Shmona Esrei. On the other hand, Rav Yechiel Mechel Tuchachinsky, the Gesher HaChaim, rules to follow astronomical sunrise. Thus, one beginning the Amida at sunrise, when davening Vasikin, or performing a daytime mitzvah like Lulav or Mila at the first possible moment, may do so when the sun begins to rise over the ground, even if the sun cannot be seen due to the natural topography. So what Rav Tuchinsky is saying, you should go to an astronomical calendar. It's going to tell you when sunrise is on that day, regardless whether there's a mountain or not, whether you can see it because there's a mountain range or not. And you can follow that sunrise time. And that's the position of the Yalkut Yosef. Astronomy. Go to an astronomical calendar. They'll tell you when sunrise is, not when you can see it, but just when it's calculated. Which is the earliest time that the sunrise can be visible above the eastern horizon at any point in the city. Model topography b'mukshav shalet Yisrael. Okay. Excuse me. It's important to note that according to most opinions, the question of whether to follow the astronomical sunrise or the visible sunrise pertains only to issues relating to sunrise itself. However, other halachic zmanim that are determined based upon sunrise, such as Allos HaShachar, the latest time for Kriya, Shema, Plaga Mincha, are always calculated using the astronomical time. So what they mean here is, people who daven Vasikin want to see the sun, so they wait. They won't do it until they won't use the astronomical. They'll wait until they see it. But calculating all the other things, like calculating Allos, etc., that should be done based on the astronomical sunrise. We'll conclude this section by noting that when it comes to reciting the immediate sunrise, the Chazon Ish is quoted as saying that one need not be overly precise in the time by making the recitation of the previous brachos longer or shorter. Rather, beginning the Amida at approximately the time of sunrise is sufficient. And the Yalkut Yosef holds the same way. You shouldn't quickly swallow words that you can get to the nates right exactly. The Rambam wrote that the precise time is not what's controlling here. It's about the time of sunrise. Adkan. If you're going to swallow words or skip words, that you shouldn't do. Okay. Well, what is the earliest time for donning talis and tefillin? It's Mishiyakir. And that has nothing to do, well, we'll see. So it's not Allos and it's not Nates, right? In addition to the two halachic zmanim that we have discussed, Allos HaShachar, Nates HaChama, there's a third halachic time during the early morning hours known as Mishiyakir, translated as one who can distinguish. Now, what are we distinguishing? The Mishnah in the Gemara in Brachas is expressed as the earliest time at which one may recite Kriya Shema in the morning, though different approaches are offered as to what a person must distinguish between. Says the Gemara in Brachas Tesam and Beis. Says the Mishnah. When is the trigger point when you can first start saying Kriya Shema in the morning? You have to be able to distinguish between blue and white. Blue and green. Should be a little harder. I guess you'd need a little more light, according to that. Tanya Reb Meir Oimer, Mishiyaker ben Ze'ev lekelev. You have to distinguish between a dog and a wolf. Rabbi Kiva Oimer ben Chamor la'arod, between a donkey and a wild donkey. V'acher moimrim, Mishiyiras chaveiro rochok arba amis v'yakirenu. You have to be able to see your friend, recognize him, with your friend being 4 amas away. Amar Rav Huna halacha k'acherim. Halacha is like acherim. By the way, who's acherim? Usually it's Rav Meir. We have a Gemara which goes through, right? We know acher. Remember who Rav Meir? One of Rav Meir's rabbis was Elisha ben Avuya. Was acher. So acher is acher, but acherim is Rav Meir as well because he was also. One of the Gemaras that we have discussed that the identity of Acherim is usually Rav Meir. Amar Abai Tefillin. So the shear of Tefillin Mishiyakir is like Rav Meir, Kacherim, which is you have to be Miyakir, your friend, Dalad Amos. L'Kriya Shema Kivasikin. Which is what? Dam Rav Yochanan. Vasikin Ayugoyim Moisoim Anetzachama. So Tefillin, according to the Gemara, is earlier, and Kriya Shema should be timed somewhat so that you can get to Kriya, to get Shmona Esrei by Vasikin. With regard to the year's time for donning Tefillin, and again, the Tzurba is going to go through it in detail. We've now studied the laws of Talis and Tefillin. So the Tzurba is dealing with the Zmanei Talis and Tefillin. The later in volume 10, we're going to have the dinim of Kriya Shema, the dinim of the Amida. There, the times of those will be dealt with in detail, just to set the table. It should be noted that despite the original halach of Mishiyak in the Mishnah pertaining to Kriya Shema, the Gemara indicates that there's some dispute, a subject that will be discussed in more detail in volume 10. So, with regard to the earliest time for putting on tefillin, Abai rules clearly that it's Mishiyakir, which is defined based on Acherim as the time when one can see an acquaintance at a distance of 4 amas and recognize him. That's clearly later than that of Allos HaShachar, which is, as discussed earlier, is when the first bit of light is visible in the sky. The Tur rules, in accordance with Abai and Acherim, that the time of Mishiyakir, of recognizing an acquaintance, is the earliest time for putting on tefillin. He then clarifies that although in principle, nighttime is considered a time during which tefillin may be donned, even if it's not the practical halacha, that is relevant only to removing tefillin after it gets dark if they were donned during the day, which is permitted until a certain time, right? People wear tefillin during the day, and then you have to take it off once night. But all agree that one may not don tefillin in the morning in a normal case before Mishiyakir. I mean, it's pretty dark, but you can't put on tefillin until Mishiyakir, which is after Allos. Says the Tur, Zman anachatan baboker, Mishiyir, the time of putting on tefillin, Mishiyir chaveiro harogli moktzas berichut al damas v'yakirenu. It's got to be a friend that you know a little bit, and you can recognize him with him being 4 amas away. Afagav the kaimalon Laila zman tefillin. So the Tur's bavorning. Well, what's the problem? If Laila zman tefillin, who cares if you put it on before Mishiyakir? Elashein moirin hainu le'inyan shem hayu b'roisha v'chashek. That's if you were wearing tefillin in the afternoon and it got dark. She'ein tzarach l'choltzon. That when it says over there that Laila zman tefillin, you have to take it off right away. But lechatchila you should never put on tefillin prior to Mishiyakir. The Beis Yosef, right? Rav Yosef Karo in his commentary on the Tur, confirms that the discussion of the Gemara and Brachos, cited above, is indeed the source for determining Mashiachir as the earliest time for Tefillin. He cites Rabbeinu Yonah, who explains why the earliest time for Tefillin was linked to seeing an acquaintance. Says the Beis Yosef. The Perek Kama de Brachas, Acher Moimrim, Mishiyiris Chaver Berichuk Arba Amos V'Yakirenu, Amra Bayo, L'Tfila Kacherim. For Shmona Esrei, it's the halachas like Acherim. It seems that the text of the Beis Yosef had the word Tfila in the Gemara and Rashi instead of Tfilin, though he understands it to mean Tfilin in any case. Our versions of the text of Gemara and Rashi already have the word Tfilin as opposed to Tfila. So it's not, so here it means L'Tfila meaning Tfilin Kacheri. Perish Rashi, L'Tfila Laniach Tfilin. Va'arifa Rosh, Gorsin Badei L'Tfilin Kacheri. Right, they had the right girsa. Because of Rabbeinu Yonah, the Atam Shatalu also Bashir. Why was the reason? Why was the Mashiach mentioned as seeing your friend? Mishum de Betfilin Kosuv Re'iyah Diksiv V'ra'u Kol Amei Haaretz Kishem Hashem Nikra Lecha V'Yaru Mimeka. Right, when it says that the nations of the world see us and are afraid of us, because we have Shem Hashem Nikra Lecha, the Gemara says it's talking about Tefillin. So the concept of Re'iyah, of seeing your friend, the Rabbeinu Yonah connects it to the concept of Mashiach here. The Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, it followed his ruling of the Tur. Zman anachasan baboiker, Mashiach chaver ragili moktzas, richik ta'adamas v'yakirenu. But you can see the development of the halacha. We went from the Gemara through the Tur to the Beis Yosef, eventually like the Mashiach. The Mishnah Berurah explains that the reason tefillin should not be worn before Mashiach is the concern exists that when they fall asleep in them before, there's a significant amount of light outside. And of course, we have to keep a guf naki, right? And we may not keep a guf naki for sleeping, right? We're going to sleep, you don't have to sleep with your tefillin. Now, what about, so fine, Mashiach is the Zman for tefillin. What about tzitzis? In contrast to the mitzvah of tefillin, the Gemara doesn't state explicitly when the earliest time is that you should put on tzitzis. The Rambam rules that like tefillin, the time of Mashiach is the earliest time for saying the bracha on tzitzis. Mutter l'adam lilbosh tzitzis balayla, bein b'chol bein b'shabbos, aval pishein zman. You can wear tzitzis at night, whether it's weekday, whether it's Shabbos, even though it's not its time. Uvad shlo yivarech, can make a bracha. Umeimasa yivarech la tzitzis b'shachar Mashiach bein tchelas shabbat l'lovin shabbat. The whole concept of when one of the Mandamrim said that you should differentiate between tchelis and lovin has to do with wearing tzitzis, because we have a blue string and a white string. So only when you can recognize the difference is when you can make a bracha on the tzitzis. It's possible that the earliest time for reciting a bracha in the morning may be subject to the machlokas between the Rambam and Rosh concerning the nature of the exemption for wearing tzitzis at night. As we discussed in volume 8, Shiur 3, these Rishonim disagree as to whether one does not recite a bracha upon wearing any tzitzis at night, the Rambam, or upon nighttime garments, regardless of when they are worn, the Rosh. The Rambam here follows his approach that no bracha is recited at night, but the Rosh may disagree that the entire issue of Mashiach and the earliest time of data before the mitzvah is irrelevant, since it depends upon the nature of the garment worn, not the time of wearing. The practical halacha concerning this machlokas as it relates to the issue of Mashiach is going to be discussed later. So although the Rambam employs the Mashiach from the Mishnah differentiating between chelis and white tzitzis strings, presumably because it deals directly with the mitzvah of tzitzis, the Beis Yosef writes, in the name of the Rosh, that the two times discussed here are identical. That of recognizing an acquaintance and distinguishing between chelis and white means the same time. So it's really Mashiach here. You don't have to remember two different zmanim. And although this is the generally accepted approach, there's a minority opinion that holds the two times are not identical. The Prima Godim, the Pinschei Tshuva, goes through that. The Beis Yosef also suggests that the Rambam derived his position from the ruling given in the Gemara for Shema and Tefillin. Says the Beis Yosef, Masha Kosav Rambam, when do you first make a bracha on tzitzis? Lo matzasi kain b'hadei. He doesn't, the Beis Yosef didn't find a source for that. The could be that it comes from the first chapter in Brachos. But Rav Yoina Sham said, Hadam Rabbi Litfilin Kacherim Kosav Zelashono, Vitzitzis Shemitzvos Bayom, Efshar Shizman Atchalosu, Gam Kein Mishiyas Chaveru, V'Yakirenu, or Efshar Shizmanu Mishiyakir Ben Chedesh Shabbat Lovan Shabbat. So the Beis Yosef brings Rabbeinu Yonah that they also say that the Zman Tzitzis follows Zman Tefillin. Although there does not appear to be any explicit source for the Rambam from the Gemara, perhaps an allusion can be brought from the Gemara Menachos to support linking the earliest time for putting tzitzis together with the earliest time for saying Kriyat Shema. Says Menachos Mem Gimel Amud Beis, Uriisem Oso, right? You have to see the tzitzis Uzchartem. Re'ei Mitzvah Zu Uzchor Mitzvah Sacher Satluya Ba. Look at your tzitzis; it'll remind you of a mitzvah that's connected. Eza Zu Kriyat Shema. Disnan. So it's a mnemonic. You're going to remember tzitzis. You're going to remember Kriya Shema by looking at your tzitzis. And the source of that is Mishiyakir. According to the Gemara, looking at tzitzis reminds one of the mitzvah to recite Kriya Shema. Since one may only recite Shema in the morning after the time that one can differentiate between the white and tchelet strings, according to the opinion given in the Mishnah. If so, looking at the tzitzis is only significant after the time that Shema may be recited. This may support the notion that the earliest time to fulfill the mitzvah tzitzis is the same as that of reciting Shema, namely Mishiyakir. The Shulchan Aruch writes that Mishiyakir is indeed the earliest time for donning tzitzis with a bracha in a normal situation. Me'emasai mavarach ala tzitzis b'shachar, Mishiyakir ben tcheles shabbat l'lavin shabbat. So we now have the definition for tefillin and tzitzis, which is the Mishiyakir. Now, what time is Mishiyakir? How does it relate to either Allos or to dates? Right? How should the time of Mishiyakir be calculated? We know that it's after the time for Allos, but it's difficult to determine an exact time for it, since it depends upon multiple factors. Plus, nowadays, it's difficult to assess since most locations have street lights by which one can see. Nevertheless, the more recent Achronim have offered different suggestions as to when it should be. The Prima Godim, cited by the Bir Halacha, proposes that Mishiyakir is merely 6 minutes after Alos HaShachar. This opinion is accepted by Rav Ovadia Yosef in Yechav Das. I the Prima Godim Shesayim B'Sov Dvar because of the Im Kein Lefi Mad Kaimelon the Amod HaShachar Ad Alos HaShemesh Ushav HaChoymesh. It's an hour, right? The time between Alois and Nates is 72 minutes. So on a loymar, the me alosa shachar adashir shiyakas chaver berichut adamasu be'erech iser shah, a tenth of an hour, which is 6 minutes. So that's the Prima Godim. The Bir Halacha rejects this opinion as illogical, though he does not posit a specific alternative calculation. On the other extreme, Rav Moshe Feinstein suggests that Mishiyakir may be just 35 to 40 minutes before sunrise in New York. And Rav Hershel Schachter of Yaakov Kamenetsky appear to accept this approach as well. And there's a footnote, if you want to see the lecture, listen to it in OU Torah. And this is problematic for people who want to, wear their talis and film earlier. Says Rav Moshe, Kfi sheyanti arbei pamim biyamim bahirim. He's examined this on clear days. Hisharti banius ishu erech lamed hey. V'ulai arboi minutim korim netzachama. He says it's 35 to 40 minutes before Nates. Other contemporary poskim do not accept this calculation. Either is they feel that it's slight enough to see an acquaintance earlier than the 40 minutes prior to sunrise. The Pischei Teshuvos cites two opinions that he feels have been the most accepted on this issue, which are that Mashiach is 52 minutes before sunrise or 60 minutes before sunrise. Well, the Indian Zman Mashiach Beit Cheselovim, Livchon Zos Al Pi HaMetzius Kimat Bilti Afri. To actually do it in experiential manner, it means go outside, look at people. Kitzach Sheyeh Yom Bilti Munah, it's got to be without clouds, Ubilti Mishtak, not snow, Ukshariach, even when the moon is not shining, Mokum Mishor, maybe a flat place, or Harim, below the Emek and out in the valley, Mustar Barim Voyim. The Gam Nosaf is Manenu Shlo you Panse Rechova Meirim. There are no street lights. So Ulvichona de Hasimana Sheni Mashiach Chaver Berichuk Tal Damas V'Yakirenu Gam B'Zeh Yesh Kama Klalim. So there's guidelines for that. Ugdolei Adoris Al Pi HaMasoros Shebeyodim Al Pi HaChanosa Nosu Lan Zman Kavua Mugdar. U'Shtei Deos Ikaros Matzir. There's two opinions. Number one, the Kafachayim, the Kafachayim, the Rav Tukachinsky, they said Shah Achaz Lefnei Neitz Chama, an hour before Neitz. Uv'Chishuv Kavua Tamid Lefi Sha'ot Shavot. And they used not halachic hours, but standard hours. And Chamishim U'Shtayim Dakos Lefnei Neitz. The Sefer Nivreshet says 52 minutes. Now the Sefer Isha Yisrael, which is a compendium of halacha on tefillah, writes that the practical custom following in Israel is to estimate it at about 50 minutes before sunrise. Tchila zman kriya shema shel shachris u'birchosei lefi ha'ofek shebe'eretz Yisrael nahug lishah zman zeh be-50 dakot lifnei netzach chama. V'yesh levada b'chol mokom et zmano al pi luach meduyak. You should check it where you are. The Yalkut Yosef mentions the opinion of the Pri HaGaon and his father, Rav Yosef, but recommends following the opinion that defines Mashiach as an hour before sunrise. Zman hanachtan baboker, putting on tefillin. Mishiyir's chaver aragili moktzas b'richuk arba amos v'yakirenu. V'yesh oimim shu k'sheish dakos achram. Some say it's 6 minutes after. V'yesh oimim shu k'shah kodem netzach chama. Some say it's 60 minutes before neitz. Lachen lechatchila en lesate petzitzis at shigir shah kodem netzach chama. So lechatchila, we're going to see there's going to be b'di'evedika cases where you have no alternative. But lechatchila, you should wait 60 minutes before neitz, not earlier than that. V'chein minig Yerushalayim. As we discussed concerning Allos HaShachar, some nowadays calculate this time based upon degrees, while others still follow the number of minutes. Thus, those who follow the number of minutes may rule that the earliest time for reciting Shema, donning Talis, and donning Tefillin with a bracha is either 60 minutes before sunrise, 52 minutes before sunrise, 66 minutes before sunrise, or 35 minutes before sunrise, depending on which opinion is accepted, regardless of location or season. Another approach is to use shows manios, so that the time is calculated using halachic hours, which fluctuate based on location and season. The number of minutes prior to the sunrise that determine the time of Mashiach would then be recalculated using the halachic hour. This is mentioned by the Minchas Kohen and was suggested practically by Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin in halachic times for home and travel. Nowadays, this approach is not widely followed, he says. On the other hand, those who follow the calculations based on degrees would calculate the position of the sun below the horizon in Jerusalem on an equinox day, right, ranging between 10 to 13 degrees based on the more commonly used opinion, then calculate the times for that position of the sun in other seasons. This is how Mashiach is calculated and presented on the MyZmanim website. According to this, Mashiach in New York could range by as much as between about 55 and 75 minutes. MyZmanim provides the standard times of Mashiach based on the sun's position at 11.1 degrees below the horizon, and also provides other options that are slightly later as well. Okay, so a complicated sugya. We're going to talk next week, what if you have to put on talis and tefillin in a case of need, which is, of course, very applicable. And we will also begin the laws of Birchas HaShachar next week. I think we'll cover the issue of when can you put on talis and tefillin early, and then we'll start Birchas HaShachar. Anybody have any comments or any other things to add?
There's a challenge.
Yes, Jacob.
I'd say the challenge if you're flying on an airplane. You know, is it night? Is it day? Where are you? Which?
Right, right.
So that's very challenging.
There's actually a website, I don't remember the web address, I'll find it and I'll post it in the chat for the next session. A site where you can go and tell them when you're flying, what flight, what time of the year, and they'll tell you exactly how many minutes in flight you can daven mincha, when you can daven ma'ariv. It's quite interesting. There is such a website. Leave it to technology.
Right.
The other thing I'm sort of sad to say is that if one followed Rav Moshe's 35 to 40 minutes, if you followed the 35 to 40 minutes as Mashiach, it would put certainly all the LA early minyanim out of business.
Right.
Like right now, the earliest talis in Finland is about 5:50 if you use an hour. So like Sharet Tzedek starts at 6 or 5:50 on Monday and Thursday. If you went to 35 or 40 minutes, you'd be at 6:15. And, especially, and this is now, last month, it was 10 minutes later. So if you follow that opinion, I mean, all the really, the minyanim that start at 6 o'clock essentially would be out of business.
Right. But now we see why. Now we see all the, the range of it. It looks like the 60 minutes is what is generally accepted, and how these minyanim rely on that.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out,
72 and 60, yeah.
is there a shita?
55 to 60. Yes, Chaim?
Is there a shita of 45 minutes? I don't see why you're not mentioning a shita over here.
Well, that could be, we have to see the halach. Remember, he mentioned it could be that halachic zmanios would give you that kind of.
Only reason because we use in Yavne, we use a calendar. It's calculated by computer by this guy, is Rabbi, can't remember his name, in Baltimore. And it's done
From Hyman?
No.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Ellie, I have to find the name over here. Ellie Riddler, Rabbi Ellie Riddler. We've been using him since Rabbi Korupkin days, and as we get all this money from that calendar. He calculates Allos Shachar at 72 minutes before Hanates, and Mishiakir at 45 minutes before Nates. So, and then he calculates Netza Chama is when the center of the sun is at a 50-minute depression angle below the horizon.
No, but you see, Chaim, you said it's 11. They talked about 11 degrees below the horizon. That's how that in Jerusalem. What they do is they calculate it based on Jerusalem. Then they see what is it where you are. They mentioned 11 degrees. It might be worth for us to, Chaim, we should call him up and find out based on what we learned tonight, based on the degree approach, he can tell us.
He was one of the people, I looked at the sheets, remember I told you some time ago I did a study, I actually looked at his. If you look at different sheets published by different people, it's almost like it's Torah Misinai, but they disagree on many things. So you don't really know what the underlying assumptions are because they just publish it out there. They're obviously basing it on some halachic opinion, and often the different sheets are based on different halachic opinions. So if you look at them, you could see 3 different times for the same, for Mishiaki. So you got to know what they're basing it on.
In the same vein, when you're flying, and then you have your Arbor conference on all night, and what do you do in the morning? You take them off, or you just resemo. So
we learned that you're mashmesh b'tefillin, you're mashmesh with the tzitzit, and then you make the bracha.
Well, I can tell you that the zmanim they use for sunrise on this calendar is exactly the same zman that, like, if you look on your Apple iPhone, it tells you sunrise time.
So they're using astronomical time.
Yeah, so that's what he's using. He's using a 0.8334 degrees depression angle below the horizon. So you're right. It's basically just that little spark of when the sun starts to come up.
Well, you saw look in the last thing we learned, where he talked about was it in the footnote?
It's interesting, by the way, Ernie.
Look at footnote 27.
Yeah.
The standard for Mashiach is based on the sun's position at 11.1 degrees below the horizon. Now, he may be using some other calculation. It was curious to find out what he's doing.
Well, he's calling it a 50-minute depression angle. So I don't know what that means. I'm not figure out what exactly they're talking about.
Okay, wonderful shir and a wonderful participation.
By the way, we'll get to it, Mitzvah Hashem, on halakha.